So let's get started. Today we're going to cover how to operationalize recovery and disaster recovery in Azure. My name is Rob Kalustian. I'm the Global Vice President of Services, or Technical Services for CommVault. I have over 25 years of IT experience and the last 20 years in storage, data, and information management. Presenting with me is Paul McClure. He's the Chief Technologist with us and is focused on cloud solutions. He has a similar background, although not as long, but he's really focused on the provider and cloud technology areas, and he'll be going over a lot of different use cases in this presentation. So how's this presentation broken out? I'm going to go over the business things to consider before going to Azure, and I promise to be brief, but I think, I was thinking when I put this together how important it is to make some choices, because when you go to a cloud environment, there's a lot of things that used to take 6 months or a year, like to stand up a large database. Do that in an hour, less than an hour, but you might not have designed it correctly, and you live with that once you put it into production. So I'm going to go over a few of those things. And then Paul's going to go through a variety of different use cases in Azure around recovery, disaster recovery, and dev test, and it'll be the more technical side. So let's get started. Thing works here. All right. So I don't know how many people recognize this line. Hopefully not any of you, or very few of you, and hopefully you won't. This picture is in Terminal 1 at O'Hare on the plane side, the terminal side for Terminal 1 for United. And this is the place where you go if you have to recover from a travel outage, meaning you need to get on a different flight, something happened with your plane. And chances are you've been in a line like this before on the security side, or even in one like this. And what I notice in that line is I'm really impatient. I'm wondering why I can't be first. Why can't I get to the front of that line? And then I look over to the left or right of me, and I see some people just are in a different line, and they walk to the front. And, I'm a little annoyed, but at the end of the day, I accept it because I understand, I'm fully aware that these airlines have flyer programs, and if you buy a first-class ticket or if you fly a lot, you get to go in a special lane because you're more important to the business for the airline. And so my recommendation is not to be an airline, but to really think about business and the business you're in. And you really need to prioritize what's most important to you. Most of us, if we have hundreds or thousands of servers that make up many applications, it may not be realistic to put everything in the same recovery architecture. And there's implications for that. So what I ask you to do is sit down, and if I asked everybody, is revenue the most important? I don't know, maybe 80% would, yes, revenue is the most important. I'd say, well, wait a minute, where do you work? Oh, I work at a hospital. Is revenue most important? No, patient care is patient life, right? You'll bill. You'll get a bill, right? The hospital will get their money. Revenue is not that important, right? So you have to really think about what are the 2, maybe 3 business criticality factors for your company to exist. Not the 13, not the 12. And then the next step is to identify applications. I hate this thing. If I say that, do you click, or is this? It's me. Okay. So you have to think about what makes up an application. Is it just the servers you own as a DBA, or is your database, are they part of a Tier 3 application with app servers and web servers? And when you look at those applications, is 100% mandatory, or is it okay if we're at 99%? Well, maybe if the web server tier is down, it's still okay. The application's fine. We don't need to do a recovery. All's good. But if one of those SQL servers on the back end are down, and I can do half the transactions that I'm normally used to doing, and I'm a credit card processing company, that isn't good. So really think about from an application view, and then things like Active Directory and networking, because when you cover, it's not just all about getting a load of data up and going in an app, it's all the other pieces. And what I ask people to do is kind of build that same mindset that we accept whether we like it or not. We truly understand why those people in that line got to go in that line because they were premier flyers. Same thing here. You say to each business unit, you say, hey, let's talk about your applications. We're going to name them, we're going to rank them on business criticality factors, and these are the ones for our company. field support. Maybe I'm a utility company, right? Field support, that power can't go down. Customer service and revenue, those might be your criticality factors. And then give a weighting score, and you have a rational discussion with each of the application owners tied to the business and say, look, I know you think your thing's important. Let's talk about it. How many people does it affect? How does it affect our business? And then you give it a score. And so now you're starting to establish that mindset internally. If you are responsible for providing that service to a body of people, look, it was fair, and it was aligned to the business, and you get to go in that other line. You get to go in this line, and you know what? You're in the longer line. Sorry, but you are. And you're important to us, but your application doesn't kill the business if something bad happens to it. The other thing you have to think about, I think, if any of us have moved, I've moved a lot. You go through your stuff, and you're like, wow, I didn't know I had a tennis racket. Or wow, I didn't know I think that's a lacrosse helmet up there, or maybe a catcher's helmet. I don't know. But you think back, did I use that? How long ago did I use that? And the same thing about going to cloud. It's easy to get there, right? But it's expensive, complicated. So you have to get some insights on your data and say, how important is that data to me? Do I need to keep it for compliance? Maybe I lock it away and archive it. And then you think about not only the cost implications and the complexity implications, but if I'm recovering a bunch of stuff, right? If I only need that one box to be moved, and I move all this other stuff, and I'm trying to bring up that app, it's going to take a long time to bring up the app because I'm bringing back triple to quadruple the stuff that I don't even need for it to be up and running. So it's extremely important. And I put a little statistic there, and a lot of people don't think about it. How much of your data is over a year old? 50 to 80%. If you're growing 25%, and you do the math, have fun with it, and start with 10 terabytes and do 25% after 4 years, 80% of it's over a year old. And it might still be important. I'm not saying it isn't, but you really have to go through that exercise. Is why are we keeping that? And the funniest thing, my consulting teams, they'll go to customers and they'll say, hey, what's your retention? And what's the, well, it's always that way. I don't even know. Right? And you find out that customers have all these different policies that over years, they just kept on making them. And then you're going to go try to provide a SLA around infinite policies. It's almost impossible to be successful because you've given too much flexibility to the customer. So let me go back. So on that same vein, once you've taken and put those applications in priority and you figured out what you need to move, now you can start to begin to build kind of like a menu of options. And all of us have phones, right? And I guarantee that I have the same phone as probably half the people in a room, and the other half probably have the same phone, but each one of us have a different plan. We might have international minutes, we might have unlimited texting, 2 gig, whatever. But it's really important to determine after you do that exercise, and you'll see bands. When we did the ranking of the servers, you'll see them kind of, let's say you have a 200-point maximum. You'll see a bunch that are 150 to 200, and then you might see a gap. You'll see 150 to 75, and then you start to see tiers and go, do I really need to offer 7 different things on the menu or 17, or can I go with 3? I'm not saying you can go with 3, but you really have to say, let's look at different plans, economy, standard, and premium, let's say, and let's define what the recovery time objective is. How long should it take for that data to be up? Does it need to be up now? Can it take 15 minutes? How old is the data? What's the point back that I'm bringing that data back? What's the retention? And then you can start thinking about the stuff he's going to cover later. So a lot of us want to rush to architecture, and they see cool things in Azure and ASR. Let's turn that on. They skip all this stuff, and they find out what they implemented isn't even something they can support. It doesn't tie back to the business. So it's really important to do these. And I tell you what, if you haven't done this before, it's not fun talking to the business units and having those arguments, but you're going to argue a lot more when something doesn't come back. So very important. And the last part of it is we covered earlier, I don't know how many of you were in the earlier session, but self-service. Nobody wants to call anybody anymore. They want to be able to select their plan, get it up and running. Just like if any of you go to Azure, you turn on stuff, you select what you want, it's up and running, and when you want to change something or do anything, it comes back. So it's very important. We'll go over some of that later in the presentation, Paul will, but it's important to think about how this thing's going to operate in real world. I've only got a few more slides back left for me. this thing works. Huh. Look, I am pressing it. Yeah, you can do it. He'll be the presser. So the other thing is, anyone who's been around a while, in the last couple of years, everyone's talking about DevOps, right? And they're talking about rolling out applications and automating lots of different tasks that used to take lots of trouble tickets. And hey, let's get rid of trouble tickets. Let's just automate it, and let's not have 19 people involved in getting a database server up, right? Well, the same thing with recovery. The old school method was to bring in someone and have all these conversations we just had, develop a bunch of binders, maybe put it, maybe we're modern and now it's on a website or something, or SharePoint, and okay, something happened, now I've got to read it. That's not cool. I mean, you do not want to be reading anything when there's a problem. So you want to automate, and I'm not telling you what to automate with. You could be using PowerShell, you could be using some aspects of APIs in a Docker. It doesn't matter, but you absolutely need to eliminate paper and eliminate documentation as much as possible and automate. And go ahead, Mr. Clicker. Oh. You're not paying attention. Last couple aspects I want to cover is from a workflow. I'll call it workflows, so orchestrating everything. And you're probably going to use a variety of tool sets when you build your environment for recovery, right? And one of the key things that I find a struggle in a lot of IT environments is, you over here might own an application. He might have decided what tools he's going to use. Nobody else knows about those tools. And he might be part of a bigger application, and nobody has a centralized repository or real understanding. And this looks like a pretty flow chart. It's actually a visual workflow builder that's in our product. I'm not here to do a pitch, but it's a visual workflow builder that allows us to link in not only things for this data management product that's at the top that's managing your on-prem and your Azure, but also you can plug in the PowerShell and Perl and whatever else you want. You can put in this master workflow that does something. In this case, let's see if, no. Let's see if my pointer works. Oh, it does. So in this case, what we're doing is we're taking something on-prem, we're bringing it to Azure, we're seeing if it's there, is all the stuff there that I want to be there. Once it is there, I'm going to start using a PowerShell script to restore a bunch of clients. Maybe these weren't real-time replicas. Maybe we're just doing a deduplicated copy to the cloud. And then when they're up, I'm going to tell somebody, hey, they're up. Right? It worked. And the thing I don't like about that is it's kind of like buying an insurance policy or doing these DR tests that people like to do and say, hey, twice a year, let's see if our stuff works. Or, hey, I just bought State Farm. I'm going to go crash my car today to see how good their insurance is and see how good my airbag. Nobody does that, right? They get in an accident and then they find out, right? And I'm saying let's not do that. It's dumb, right? It's just as dumb as signing up for insurance and running out into the highway and seeing what happens. What I'm saying is let's get value out of that asset. If you're going to push it to Azure, if you're going to make copies of it, do something with it. And if you do something with it, in this case, this is taking that same workflow, tacking on, let me verify that data. Let me bring up the application. Maybe I'm going to do a SQL query. Maybe I'm going to do some compares on checksums on different data files to say, look, I'm reasonably sure that data is good, right? And I'm going to even take it another step further, and I'm going to let the dev test guys or gals take that data, and they're going to do something with it today. So maybe they're doing refreshes of app builds and doing dev test work. Let's build that into the way we live. That way, if there's a problem, I know how to deal with it because I live that way every day versus the old way of, oh crap, this hadn't happened ever and we don't use it and oh my gosh. And that's what happens a lot if you don't orchestrate and test. And that's the number one failure besides human error in these recovery scenarios is it gets really complicated. We haven't recovered in a long time. It's not built into the way we live, breathe, and sleep, and now we don't know what to do. So it's very important that you orchestrate it, test it, and we'll go over a few different scenarios when Paul's up, but use it. Don't just pay for that stuff to be copied somewhere. Get some value out of it. So that concludes my business/boring part. I'd like to turn it over to Paul to go over some use cases, okay?
Thanks, Rob. Just echoing some of the comments that Rob's made, when I first started my IT career, I was actually working in local government out in Australia, if you couldn't tell that my accent wasn't local, Chicago. And one of the biggest things I learned, not only aligning your prioritization to cost, it's a very important factor in organizations. It will choose the infrastructure used, it will choose the mechanism used for protection and recovery. But to echo Rob's point, you really need to align that to the business. And as a real-world example I've lived through, my hometown's susceptible to flooding, and working in the local government organization, you have responsibility from everything from movie theaters and caravan parks to sewage treatment plants, right? And in the event of a flood where you've got computer systems controlling the floodgates that potentially impact sewage leaking into the water mains, really you have to think about what impact that will have to a city and those kind of things. So, you know, I remember in that particular scenario during flooding where we've got the guy from the caravan park on the phone saying, my server's down and I need to be back up immediately because I can't check people out because they're trying to evacuate the park. Yet we've got a real, you know, health risk of, you know, the sewage treatment plant potentially polluting the water streams. So you've really, you know, that's a very extreme example, but I'm sure in any of your businesses, in any of your verticals, and if there's any service providers out here on behalf of your customers that are offering these kind of SLAs, these are the kind of considerations that you need to make. It all starts with the business. Another thing, we're talking about how do we operationalize, how do we automate some of these tasks. And the key bit of advice I give to anybody I'm talking to on this subject is you can't automate what you haven't standardized. So if you're an IT organization or an IT provider who, you know, will literally do, you know, anything that the business demands, then you're at extreme risk of not being able to recover and not being able to recover efficiently in these kind of situations. Rob mentioned self-service. Self-service gives you the ability to have the smart people, the architects, the engineers, go and take these business elements and apply them to the technology. But the nice thing about self-service and automation is you can actually out-task that recovery to the people who need it the most. So in the scenario that I mentioned around the local government council, had we had self-service and automation in that case, we could have been over-focusing on the priority, which is make sure the sewage treatment plant is all intact and recoverable and operational, whereas with a self-service interface, our guy at the caravan park that was screaming because he couldn't check customers out would have had a self-service capability to go and serve himself. So these are some of the key elements. Just to repeat, you can't automate what you haven't standardized. And if you think across those, that kind of mentality. First recovery case, we're going to talk about a few different recovery cases here, but the first one we're going to cover is around disaster recovery. In most of these examples, I'm trying to give examples of where we leverage Azure. In some cases, it's local recovery to maybe a hypervisor or a local virtualized system as well. So first piece I'm going to start with, and this is the very top, I've tried to align to Rob's table, act like a service provider. And again, that comes to how do we standardize? The mobile phone example is a classic of here's your phone, but here's all of the multiple plans available to you based on your recovery requirements. So first piece I'm going to cover is literally that near-time replication. Every piece of data, every write, every transaction is being replicated off-site in this scenario to Azure. Okay? And we've got that protection there that should we have an outage, you can also create point-in-time copies that should we corrupt the source data, we can go back to previous versions and ensure recovery in the shortest possible recovery time. You also have an ability to effectively relocate that backup and backup processing. So for our long-term retention, our long-term copies that maybe in your industries you need to keep for compliance, you have an ability to replicate the data into Azure and now protect that data for long-term retention on a really cost-effective tier of storage like the Azure Blob Storage. So in recovery, of course, you can't recover anything that you haven't protected, which is why I'm starting with a protection scenario first. So as we look at the recovery scenario here, data outage or data corruption, server offline, site offline, we now simply have an ability to go and promote that replica and make that the active copy. But to Rob's point earlier, does that mean we're done? Well, absolutely not. Because depending on your DNS configuration and your networking, depending on whether that was a file share that we've replicated, yes, we've got the data intact, yes, we've got it recovered and available, but from a user perspective, they don't know where the data is. They have no access to that data. So it's not just a consideration of we've protected it, we've recovered it, we've made it available. There's ancillary systems around it that we need to look to automate in coordination with our recovery to say, right, now we're going to fail over our DNS. Now we're going to, or update our DNS records. We're potentially going to, in a file sharing scenario, look at a technology like DFS namespace that has one global namespace for your users so that when we fail over, it's as seamless as possible to the end user. All things that fall outside the traditional architecture and just have another copy of the data and replicate it. The amount of times we hear from organizations that say, well, I don't need to protect my data because I've got it replicated, right? You corrupt the source, you corrupt the replica. You've got to have those point-in-time copies to come back to, and you've got to have a contingency plan around that in order to be able to manage it. So just stepping back, the premium service plan. It's great, it's fast, you can recover everything, and if you set business SLAs of inside an hour or possibly even more aggressive, around 15-minute recovery times, that's fantastic. But does it apply to every workload, every application, every system that you have in your environment? Because of the SLAs involved, it inherently implies it's the most expensive method in which to provide that level of recovery. So by tiering those applications out and making those business decisions, now we can start to step down through the layers of technology that apply and align back to the business and your spend. So standard and economy plans that Rob summarized earlier, we've got a couple of different ways in which that might apply. So starting out with a use case of some physical servers, agent-based protection, so the traditional data protection, local recovery copies on site. Why is that handy? Shortens your backup window, ensures we've got that local recovery, and it takes the WAN out of your recovery scenario. If you need to recover back to on-site, on-prem, the physics of the WAN will often get in the way there. But good due diligence, they always talk about multiple copies of data in multiple locations, one off-site. Okay, Azure is a perfect target for that. Very cost-effective. Provides that not only that storage capability, but it also means you can pay as you consume, I should say, and gives you a recovery option into the cloud, rather than the traditional method of I've got my primary data center, I build another fully burdened DR facility, right, and I might use it in the case of a disaster. Because even though lots of organizations talk about DR testing, there's so many that don't have the discipline to actually go and test that over and over and over again. And where things like automation and orchestration really come into play, Rob's point about the runbooks earlier. What happens when you change something? You need to go and update all of your runbooks. And if you don't have that discipline, don't have that capability, all of a sudden you're in a disaster scenario and 3 things have changed since you wrote that massive runbook, and now you can't recover appropriately. So moving the data off-site, very good practice. From a recovery perspective, in the scenario where my servers have gone offline, so my physical servers have gone offline, you have your local recovery copy available, and effectively the ability in this scenario that we're demonstrating here to do a P2V based recovery. So we backed up a physical machine with agents. We're automatically going to provision the VMs that we need. In a Windows-based scenario, it boots into the pre-execution environment, loads the basic OS, pulls in the CommVault agent, and then does a bare metal recovery from there. So being able to do that P2V transition across both VMware and Hyper-V. Okay? So quite a powerful proposition there. It gives you some additional options. It also can be used for other use cases. So this is a disaster recovery example, but how do we lifecycle out some old infrastructure? There's a way to do it, yet keep your legacy data intact, and the ability to go and provision that in a VM at any point that's relevant. From the off-site recovery scenario, let's say the data I need to access, the copy of data I need to access is expired on the local disk, that local copy. Or for whatever reason, whether it was a power spike that took out my physical servers, maybe it took out my backup server as well, what we'd call a media agent in CommVault terminology. Now you have the capability, and it's completely automatic. If copy A is unavailable, we automatically revert to copy B. Is it slower recoveries across the WAN? Of course it is. But we still automate that process of saying, I've gone to my default, it's unavailable, automatically fail to the next copy, and recover from there. Okay? That's a really common scenario that is helped solve simply by having an architecture that supports it. From here, that might be unacceptable for a lot of organizations. I can't wait. If I've got lots and lots of data, I can't wait 24 hours. I can't wait potentially a week if it's a whole lot of data for the data to come back across the WAN. Because remember, on recovery, technologies like dedrip don't apply, right? You've got to rehydrate that data for the recovery because that's the way in which the machine receives it. So that's where the cloud is becoming a much more common platform to operationalize that recovery. Same kind of process, taking that agent-based protection. We've got a complete site outage. I've got a data copy in the cloud. We can automate the process of going and provisioning some VMs, okay? And then driving the recovery process into your virtual machine infrastructure. Doing all of the conversions, physical to cloud, and bare metal recovery from end to end, right? Another key consideration around disaster recovery is actually creating recovery groups. So Rob was talking about the workflows and that automation piece. You can go and define subsets based on business rules of this is the priority group and this is the order in which I want to recover them in. The amount of times I've been involved in things like an Exchange recovery scenario where you have to go and recover Active Directory first, and you have to recover, for example, Exchange in the appropriate order. Otherwise, you can recover the data. You're not going to have any service to your users until you have all of those dependent services up and available. With workflow, you can go and create all of those groups and all of that prioritization and have the checks and balances in place to ensure that with every step of the way, we've checked all of the boxes that we need to ultimately recover the service to the business. So next scenario I'm going to talk about is, well, what if my data source is not a physical machine or it's not an agent in a virtual machine guest, but we're actually addressing it at the hypervisor layer? So that proxy-based backup method. One of the key things that we've been working on at CommVault recently, and a lot of our roadmap is driven by our customers, driven by our service providers, requests from these kinds of organizations. We've done a lot of work with an organization in the Netherlands, and we're doing a huge amount of work with an organization down in New Zealand at the moment around Windows Azure Pack integration. Because in these organizations, the controller of data protection and data recovery is not your traditional storage guy or backup administrator. It's managed by the guy who runs the stack, right? They want to leverage the interface in which they use to orchestrate and manage that entire stack. So integration into Windows Azure Pack and capabilities around automation of tenant provisioning in a service provider use case, choosing your service plan or your recovery plan, what Rob was talking about earlier, and then the ability to onboard and recover from that mechanism is really key to be able to support those kind of use cases. Driving through the agentless recovery, again, we select our source data. We use the proxy-based recovery method, local recovery options with an additional copy into the cloud. You have an ability to choose whether we just synchronize that copy to the cloud, whether we just send a subset of that data to the cloud, or possibly whether we even delay that copy to happen at a point in time. That all depends on your recovery requirements and the SLAs in which you need to service the business. So, same kind of scenario. My hypervisor goes offline. Now I have the ability to go and provision VMs, right? These are the kind of things that you can out-task. So, administrator defined, policy controlled, one of the scenarios that we've seen with some of our organizations with Azure, going and provisioning a certain instance type has a cost implication, right? And if you don't need as powerful a machine up in Azure for the workload that you're servicing, and you have an ability to opt into a lower tier, then that's when we can start to get really smart about this and say, for certain types of recovery operations, based on policy and based on this automation, the user who's actually recovering only has an ability to provision a certain class of virtual machine. That controls my spend. Another issue that we see in these kind of scenarios is if it's DR, I may only need it for a couple of weeks. If it's dev test, it might be less than that. It might also be longer than that. But what really burdens your spend when leveraging the cloud, you pay for what you consume. Fantastic. But if you overpay based on I only needed it for a week, yet I looked a month later and it was still running and it was still on the meter, then that becomes very expensive very quickly. So the ability to provision also allows you to control lifecycle based on policy. So for this operation that I'm doing, I'm going to set a lease time of 1 month. After a month, then you've got some business rules around, do we tear it down, do we pause it, do we alert an administrator, do some kind of business action that helps me control my spend rather than get a massive bill that we didn't understand. So we've now provisioned our VMs. The difference with the hypervisor recovery is, of course, let's say VMware was my source. I've got it in a VMDK format. Well, I can't just go and plug that in to Azure. Firstly, we've got to go and do a conversion of the virtual machine disk, okay? And then we go and attach those disks to the virtual machines that we've gone and provisioned, right? Doing the conversion means that now we've got it in a native format that Azure can understand, and we've recovered that environment. Again, the ability to, as Rob mentioned, go and run post-deployment operations. You might pull in, you know, a workflow or a Chef or Puppet or any kind of PowerShell, any kind of operational piece to actually go and say, with this SQL database that I've just recovered, can I go and run some live queries on that and prove that it's actually recovered? Similar considerations to what I had earlier. Do we need to update DNS records? Do we need to, you know, is there changes that we need to make to ensure that my users can now access the data as they did in production? You've also got to make some decisions in, is the infrastructure I'm running on in recovery, is it good enough to run in production? Because for a period of time, you're going to be running in production, and then you need to understand about, well, do we send it back on-prem, or is that where this application lives for the rest of its days? Because now, if you can recover something to the cloud, you can transition something to the cloud. And so then it becomes a business decision of, do I even replace this infrastructure? Do I even replace this workload on-prem? Or is the level of service I'm getting out of the cloud now suitable? And you take your in-the-cloud application and then apply disaster recovery mechanisms in a cloud-to-cloud kind of scenario, or potentially region to region, depending on which provider you're using. So
this is a long talk, and I want to make sure, because you're going to go over some more scenarios. If anybody has a question on all the different slides we just talked about, and I didn't pause for that in the beginning, I'd like to at least allow maybe 5 minutes now so you can get that question out and don't have to remember it for the next 25 minutes.
Sure.
And then we'll go on to more pieces of his presentation if anybody has a question right now.
Yeah, this is a good logical point to stop. So the disaster recovery piece that we've just spoken about with multiple tiers, any questions on that? Anything that you'd like us to address? We're not today, no. We do have demo capabilities over at our booth. The thing with disaster recovery demos, it's kind of press the button and sit and wait while the recovery happens. It's in a large room, it's quite a difficult process to demo. Sorry, could you repeat that for me? Yeah, that's a good question. So there's multiple ways in which you can actually achieve that, and some of them are technology decisions that you need to make around that. You know, the simple method is, okay, now I treat that as my primary. But again, part of the reason I mentioned does this application now live in the cloud, or are we going to recover back on-prem? That will actually determine part of your failback process. So like we have an ability to orchestrate recovery, you know, and things like recovery groups and various other things, you have an ability to go and build and, of course, test and automate the process of failback once we've actually recovered to the cloud.
You know, I showed you some workflows that were recovery-oriented to get everything going on the other side. You can, with that builder, move things backwards and say, okay, this is the workflow to do exactly the reverse of that. It's all about scheduling when you can do that. And depending, if you have a Tier 3 app, you might move pieces of it over, right? If you have a bunch of web servers, do we need to move all of them over now? Or can we move a couple over and load balance across Azure and on-prem, and then move a couple application servers over so you don't have to do you know, everybody look away while I move everything over for the next couple hours. You can do a gentle, I'll call it more of a gentle migration, where you take some stuff out of Azure. And like he said, maybe it is ultimately where you want to be in Azure anyway, and you might just use that as an excuse to stay in Azure. But we could absolutely build a workflow that did the reverse of what I showed, that would do more of a blended movement of the different tiers of servers over.
The other thing that we've also built in is you can make workflow interactive. So you can actually prompt the user. You might set the default and say these 5 machines are part of this recovery group, but in your specific recovery scenario, you can provide a capability to say, actually, I'm going to prompt the user and basically confirm that these 5 machines are the ones you want, deselect a couple, and then go and run your recovery operation. So it's very, very flexible in that sense. It just depends what, you know, I guess, whether it's an administrator or an end user, whether you'd give that control, so the profile of your user, and also the specific recovery scenario that you're looking for. Did that address your question around failback? Yep, thank you. Any other questions? Cool, thank you.
How do you feel your solution compares, better or worse, against what Microsoft's already kind of building into their platform and their products?
Yeah.
That we've been experiencing here. Why would you CommVault versus use Microsoft?
It's a really good question, and the answer is, and this is always the bad way for a vendor to answer a question, it depends, right? So in some scenarios, we will actually complement the Microsoft technologies. In other scenarios, we would be a replacement for those. And, you know, in the past also, CommVault, you know, we've got a very close relationship with Microsoft. We've also demonstrated where there is some overlap in our technologies that we, you know, will work in with that as part of, you know, an ecosystem kind of play rather than, you know, directly compete. But I would say it also comes back to the pieces that Rob covered first. In some cases, for certain applications or certain workloads, CommVault's potentially not going to be the right technology for you in every scenario. Where we think we differentiate is that because we're not just you do it this way and you do it this way for everything, we give you multiple different ways within a single control panel, a single piece of orchestration to say, for application class A, it gets this. For B, C, D, and E, you know, they get something slightly different, but here's one interface to understand, orchestrate, report, you know, build if necessary.
I mean, to answer it a little bit more direct is, you know, ASR, there's some great updates that Microsoft just did recently. It's awesome, but I looked at, I've been reading a lot on it, and it looks like there's some complexity. I mean, maybe you know how to do it, but there's some complexity around all the things you have to do with SQL to set up the SQL replicas, to have part of SQL on-prem, part of it in the cloud, and you've got to set that up for every instance, and you've got to do a lot of maintenance around it, and it will work. But there's a lot of, like the blog entry I read just the other day was lots of pages, and it looked like there's some problems. So, and then there's the other aspect of if you need historical, if you're going to tie in any other things that is not even part of the discussion today, well, a little bit, but e-discovery, you want compliance copies. Well, you got it replicated, but most of the time you're not, unless you did what I said about dev test, right? What about tomorrow when the lawyer wants something, or, you know, and do you have the granularity? So Microsoft is awesome with a lot of their new updates, but sometimes the granularity isn't there even for their own applications, and some of the feature sets around discovery in litigation or holds of data, or if you're looking to do some deduplication of data, or you want a hybrid solution where you've got some on-prem copies that are deduplicated, and then maybe you've got some Unix over here. I mean, if you're a pure Microsoft shop, I still think there's value to it from all the other things I just discussed about granularity and litigation and other stuff, but many of us have other things like VMware mixed in with Hyper-V, with a variety of things, and that's where it gets complicated, because earlier I said use the best tool, and you can bet your butt that, you know, if we all went and chose our best tools, we'd all have different ones, and there's really no, I don't want to call it a hypervisor, but there's no umbrella over it all managing all that. And I'd say looking at a data protection, data management vendor like us, we can actually leverage, you can say, go ahead and use ASR for this bit of it to make the premium plan, but Microsoft doesn't provide, you know, a 7-year copy for the cost that you're looking for. It doesn't give you the granularity. So you're probably going to want to mix in and leverage some of the best things that they have and bind it together with something that we have.
And I think, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to demo it, but it would have been boring to script.
Do your orchestration orchestrate in those new bits of the word against Microsoft using these days, new pieces of like ASR, can you
Yes.
orchestrate those pieces in
Yeah.
part of the overall orchestration of the product? Or again, is that
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an API inside us. So there's an API library, and you can say, look, I know this thing check client. I don't want to have to program that. CommVault's got this huge open API library. Just drag the box over, but I want to use this external thing, and it could be You talked about the Azure packs and some of the libraries there. It can be virtually anything external can be put in the workflow.
So all of our workflow processes is addressable via REST APIs. So you've got, I guess, two modes of operation. One, you can have external parties make calls to our workflow and initiate that, that process, or we can make external calls to third-party applications and manage it that way.
I mean, the one thing I'll add on this, since you asked and someone asked to demo it, I tried it, but it's boring. But essentially, he went over a use case where you picked an A0 type configuration in Azure or whatever for the workload. We absolutely can control that. That's in our product, our data protection product, so that when you do that whole recovery stream, you're not going, oh God, I better go to Azure and create all this stuff to have a landing zone or a catcher's mitt. You can put together a whole workflow that not only recovers the data, but prepares the receiving systems the right way that you'd like and limits it so that you can even give out, even for non-recovery scenarios, you could say, look, if anybody wants Azure, I'm not giving anybody any credentials. You can go to this website. You can choose from the policies that I put there to say, how many systems do you want? Which ones are we going to even let this guy choose because he's in this department? He shouldn't need the biggest, beefiest system. That can all be orchestrated from a self-service portal, and you can hide the complexities and keep the security. That's the other thing we didn't talk about too much is security, right? And it's not just encryption and deduplication. It's what do you want to show your user? Do you want to show them everything? Do you want to show them everything under the covers, or do you just want them to see the assets that they own? And that's the other complexity with some of the bits of Azure and others is, you might just have to give them a key that you don't want to give them to do some things, whereas, we might be able to limit some of that and put a mask on it.
Another piece that I think is relevant, going back to Rob's slide, between 50 and 80% of the data that you often have in production is typically stale, irrelevant, not accessed, and impacts your ability to recover. So a differentiator from a CommVault perspective, we're not just backup, we're not just replication and DR and those kind of technologies. You have an ability to go and do some data profiling, understand what that looks like, and then through hierarchical storage management, tier the legacy data off into the appropriate storage tier. So now we're focused on the 30, 40% of the data that's relevant and needs to service that SLA, but we still have retained and indexed and cataloged all of the legacy data. So a big differentiator in that sense. It just takes what might be 3, 4 separate products and consolidates it down into one infrastructure, one interface, and one set of learning, one set of training. And that's probably the key difference that we have over any technology in the market. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
I came in late, so I may have missed something. Do you do incrementals forever?
Yes.
And you would do that, able to do that in the cloud through Azure as well?
Correct, yes.
And does that require your agent, your software in the cloud?
It depends on where you're actually, excuse me, it depends on where you're actually synthesizing the full copy of the data. But in a case where you're doing that operation in the cloud, then you would need our media agent provisioned on a virtual instance in the cloud. If you're doing that locally and then just sending the data across, then no. So you could do the incremental forever piece, synthesize the full with our deduplication technology, what we call a dash copy. So that's that replica to the cloud.
Yeah, I mean, so if you have an on-prem server that's sending stuff to Azure, you don't need a receiver there because you can configure the Azure storage as a receiver, and you could just send the incrementals through an on-prem virtual or physical server to an Azure storage target. So you don't need to have a system up in the cloud. Or, to his point, you can. There's different options and why you'd want to do that, but it does not, to answer your question, we do not require that because we have native connectivity to the Azure storage target.
So there's a lot of technologies out there that require a specific gateway. Because we're a software vendor and we can talk to REST-based libraries natively, we don't need to. It becomes an architecture choice based on what you're trying to achieve. Typically, though, when you want to recover into the cloud, that's when you'll have that infrastructure in the cloud, because that's your recovery mechanism from that perspective. Yeah. Any other questions before we move on to some of the dev test scenarios? So we're going to talk dev test here for a little bit, but another scenario I'd like you to think about is around audit. So again, one of the organizations when I was doing a lot of consulting that I worked with was actually around horse racing and gambling in Australia. And one of the things that they needed to For audit purposes, they needed to take their production database, which was SQL-based, and prove that not only could they recover it, but prove they could recover at point in time. The reason for that, when they'd have allegations of race fixing and inquiries from a gambling perspective, they needed to, at the start of each particular session, prove through audit that they could actually recover this. Now, you don't want to do this manually every single time. That makes no sense. Obviously, the racing happens on the weekend. The administration of that, is something that you don't want to, basically have a manned environment to be able to achieve this. How did we get around it? We automated it. So not only did we automate the backup piece, we automated recovery and the recovery scenario, and then we automated proof that we could actually go and run queries against that piece of data. A lot of those same principles apply in a dev test kind of scenario. And we see many organizations, in fact, Microsoft in certain parts of their environment use our technology in production quite extensively, but some of their environments, they back up production, and every night they recover it to dev test. Completely automated process, completely segregated environment. They've got a live copy of data for development and test effectively every 24 hours. Completely orchestrated end to end. So these dev test capabilities, again, we're talking a hypervisor-based scenario, but also for operational efficiencies, you don't want your backup administrator doing this. You don't, it makes no sense. You want them to define it, you want them to prove that it works, but then we want to out-task that to the individuals who need to use it. The developer, the test team, for example, where on demand they can go and provision this kind of infrastructure. This is actually a capability that we use ourselves at CommVault. We were running into capacity and spend issues with our on-prem hypervisor and storage capabilities. Our dev guys couldn't wait until we continually provision more infrastructure and more storage. We gave them a capability to go and provision in the cloud, to go and refresh data sets so that they could work on production or near production copies of data and automate the entire process. They simply go to a web interface, they select the recovery scenario that's been created for them, that they have a trimmed set of permissions to go and see, and effectively the data appears on the other side, and now they can continue to work and continue to operate. So we've gained lots and lots of efficiencies as an organization by automating a lot of this piece and providing self-service that they don't need to dive into the CommVault GUI. They don't need to understand, all of the elements around, storage policies and schedule policies and all of those things that are inherent to a backup system. They understand that simple web interface and the type of recovery operation that they need to achieve. So similar process to disaster recovery, but again, this is where you make the business choices of which infrastructure is relevant to the job that I'm doing. Some of the things that we've got coming down the road from a technology perspective is once we've actually recovered that workload, excuse me for one sec, can we actually do some analysis of that to say, did my spend warrant or justify the infrastructure that I went and provisioned? Did I utilize it to the maximum of its capability? And if not, can I then go and adjust that to align my spend to the workload that I'm leveraging in the cloud, right? So same process that we discussed before, the difference being here, it's not a total hypervisor outage. I need these 3 machines in this recovery order in order to be able to recover my dev test scenario. Recover into the cloud, same process like a disaster recovery scenario. However, the bits that we've got an ability to go and orchestrate and automate now is how do I integrate with third-party apps? Can I control the provisioning and versioning? In some cases, you have dependencies on application versions. Have I ensured compliance with that? Can I go and run a whole bunch of test scenarios? Automate the examples that we gave earlier, like a SQL query, or go and run some web commands or REST API calls or whatever's relevant to what you're actually doing, and prove, get a little checklist back of, yes, we've got the data in a valid configuration. And then, of course, the complete DevOps piece. So CommVault has an ability to deploy third-party packages. We also have an ability, as we touched on in the scenario before, to go and make calls to third-party applications. This is where, with tools like Chef and Puppet and Vagrant and various others, whatever your DevOps tools of choice are, you have an ability to go and orchestrate that process and drive it. When you come back to the self-service scenario, again, it means that you can put all of your smarts in at configuration time and build time, have that tested and validated, and now we can out-task that to the appropriate user. The test team might have no idea how to go and create that environment, right? But you've got an ability to go and do that and automate the process for it through orchestration. So that's our dev test scenario. Again, we'll pause and we'll ask a few questions, and then I'll ask a question of the audience for someone to have a chance for the Xbox. So I might ask Rob to return to the stage if he'd like to. Yes, sir.
Do you want to do it? Yeah.
It would depend on the data set, but we could certainly orchestrate the process of doing that for sure.
Yeah, it depends if you wanted us to find those patterns, and then, or if you already had a pattern list. It's easier, if you have a pattern list, but we do actually have the ability, and I know not everyone was in the earlier session, but we can look inside of objects files and look for patterns and do things once we find those patterns, whether it's put them in quarantine or delete them or what have you. Yes, it can be built into the workflow.
As an example of that, we've got a piece of technology that we call reference copy. And reference copy actually allows you, it's not bound by jobs like a traditional data protection scenario, but it allows you to query across jobs based on, owner, attributes, right down to actual content if you want to. And you could go and create a special copy of that data. In that scenario, you might trim out the things that you're looking for. Again, depending on the data file, we couldn't do it against binary files or executable. We need to be able to scrape that data out. But you could go and create a special copy that doesn't have some of that data and do your recovery scenario from there. So there's a number of different ways in which you could leverage that capability. Any other questions on the dev test piece?
Or any piece.
Or anything we've discussed today? Yeah. No? Very good. All right, so I have a question for a chance to win the Xbox. Rob's probably not going to like my question, but that's all right. So I spoke about it earlier, and it was actually, I think it's one of the key points, and so much so that I repeated a couple of times through the presentation. But what's the key criteria to be able to automate? Oh, look at this. I haven't even finished the question. What's the key criteria to be able to automate any task? It doesn't matter whether it's CommVault or otherwise.
He raised his hand first, right?
So?
He raised his hand first, right? He did. You raised your hand first, I think.
All right. Thank you. Congratulations. We shall, I'll come and deliver that.
Now you're really going to go standardized when you're done?
Cheers, man.
You're not, right? You're going to just standardize your own thing and nobody else, right? Yeah. We do have demo facilities back at our booth, and we can go over workflows. There are people skilled in that there, and if you are interested and want to have a further conversation with Paul or I, we're sticking around here for any follow-on questions you'd like to have more detail on, or if you'd like to see a demo later, we absolutely can do that for you. Anything else? Any other questions? If not, we're done a little early.
Yes, sir.
At the booth.
At the booth we do, yes.
Yes, there's more Xboxes. Thank you.